They were two women from two completely different worlds. One was the picture of 1960s beauty, soft-spoken, doe-eyed, and instantly adored. The other was sharp, daring, and unapologetically unconventional. Yet both Pattie Boyd and Yoko Ono would end up rewriting the history of the world's most famous band, whether they wanted to or not. When people look back on the Beatles, the spotlight usually falls on Lennon and McCartney, the songwriters, the voices, the creative force. But behind the scenes, two women were quietly shaping the very direction of the band's story. One with charm and quiet inspiration, the other with defiance, controversy, and a presence that many fans never forgave. The clash between Pattie Boyd and Yoko Ono has become almost mythological. Fans debate it even today, who had more influence, who was really to blame for the chaos that followed. Did Yoko resent Pattie, or was the rivalry blown out of proportion? To understand it, we have to peel back the layers, not just of the Beatles' music, but of the messy, human drama that unfolded when love, fame, and jealousy collided at the height of the Swinging Sixties. Pattie Boyd was the ultimate English rose. When she appeared in glossy magazines in the early 1960s, she seemed to capture the effortless style of the decade before anyone else did. Long blonde hair, playful innocence in her eyes, and a fashion sense that made designers want her in their clothes instantly. She wasn't loud. She wasn't provocative. She was the kind of woman who turned heads without even trying. And yet, Pattie wasn't just another model on the rise. She would go on to become the muse for some of the most iconic songs ever written. George Harrison's timeless Something was about her. Eric Clapton's haunting Layla was too. Two of the greatest rock musicians in history went to war over her love. That kind of influence doesn't just make you a part of history, it makes you the pulse of it. Now compare that to Yoko Ono. Where Pattie blended seamlessly into the Beatles' glamorous orbit, Yoko cut through it like a blade. She wasn't British, she wasn't a model, and she wasn't the type of woman Beatles fans wanted to see next to John Lennon. She was avant-garde, unapologetically strange, and fiercely independent. To John, that was intoxicating. To fans, it was unforgivable. Pattie was the kind of woman fans felt they already knew, relatable, familiar, almost like she belonged in the Beatles' world. Yoko was the outsider, walking straight into the inner circle and refusing to leave. And that difference, the adored muse versus the despised intruder, would follow them both for decades. It's easy to assume the two women must have hated each other. After all, their reputations couldn't have been more different, but the truth is more complicated. If anything, Yoko's real rivalry wasn't with Pattie herself, it was with the idea of Pattie Boyd. Pattie represented acceptance, adoration, and effortless charm. Yoko represented disruption, controversy, and a refusal to fit in. Fans loved one and vilified the other. And for Yoko, who was already dealing with public scrutiny, that comparison must have stung. But to really understand how these two women ended up tied so deeply to the Beatles, unraveling, we need to rewind. Who was Pattie Boyd before she became the muse of rock royalty? And how did Yoko Ono, a woman from Tokyo with an entirely different path, end up in the eye of the Beatles' storm? It all started with Pattie, the girl from Somerset who had no idea she'd be swept into the biggest whirlwind of the 20th century. Long before she was linked to George Harrison and Eric Clapton, she was just a teenager navigating a turbulent family life, divorced parents, step-siblings, and the feeling of being shuffled from one place to another. Hardly the glamorous beginnings you'd expect from the woman who would later become the face of 1960s London. But if Pattie had one gift, it was presence. She had that undefinable quality that made people stop mid-sentence when she walked into a room. Even before she was famous, people sensed she was different. And when she stepped into modeling, the world caught on quickly. Vogue, Vanity Fair, Elle, within a few years, she was everywhere. Her path to the Beatles began in the most unexpected way. A simple commercial gig. A director liked her look, cast her in a film, and suddenly she found herself on the set of A Hard Day's Night, standing face to face with George Harrison. What happened next would alter not only her life, but the course of Beatles history. While Pattie's story was unfolding in London, halfway across the world Yoko Ono was carving out a very different life. Born in Tokyo to a wealthy family, Yoko grew up surrounded by both privilege and hardship. After moving to New York, she threw herself into the underground art world, creating experimental performances that were as confusing as they were bold. To most people, her work seemed bizarre, screaming into microphones, cutting up clothes, or presenting blank canvases as art. But to John Lennon, who was drowning in fame and desperate for something real, Yoko's boldness was magnetic. Where Pattie symbolized comfort and inspiration, Yoko symbolized rebellion and reinvention. She wasn't just a girlfriend. She was an idea, a philosophy, a force that Lennon couldn't resist. And that's where the collision course began. When you put the stories side by side, you see the contrast clearly. Pattie Boyd was the dream girl who inspired timeless love songs. Yoko Ono was the storm who broke rules and challenged the band's very identity. They never had to speak much, because the world had already cast them as rivals. But the rivalry wasn't just about two women, it was about what they represented. Pattie was nostalgia, the safe and adored muse. Yoko was change, disruption, and the unknown. And caught between them were four men who just happened to be the Beatles. As the 1960s rolled on, those dynamics would only grow more complicated. Affairs, betrayals, and artistic battles would tear through the band's world. And in the middle of it all, Pattie Boyd and Yoko Ono would find themselves forever tied to the rise and fall of the Beatles. But before the infamous love triangles, before the accusations, before the band crumbled, we have to start at the beginning. Who exactly was Pattie Boyd, the woman who captivated George Harrison and Eric Clapton alike? How did a shy teenager from Somerset become the most sought-after muse of the rock era? That's where the story truly begins. Pattie Boyd's story begins far from the glamorous world of Vogue covers and Beatles stardom. She was born on March 17, 1944, in Somerset, England, during a time when the world was still in the grip of war. Her early childhood was anything but stable. The Boyd family moved frequently, and when her parents eventually divorced, the upheaval left lasting marks on young Pattie. She experienced the loneliness of boarding schools, the confusion of blended families, and the restless feeling of not quite belonging anywhere. Yet even in those years, there was something about Pattie that stood out. She had a quiet charm, a softness that people remembered, and though she wasn't academically gifted, she carried herself with a kind of grace that drew others in. By her late teens, Pattie was working as a trainee at the Elizabeth Arden Salon in London. It could have been just another ordinary job, but fate intervened. One of her clients suggested she try modeling, and with that small nudge, her life changed course. In 1962, Pattie stepped into the world of fashion, and within months she was appearing in magazines that defined the era. She had the fresh, youthful look that editors and photographers adored. Her big blue eyes, straight blonde hair, and playful innocence fit perfectly with the new wave of style that was sweeping London. Soon, she was being photographed by the biggest names in the industry, from David Bailey to Brian Duffy. Designers began tailoring entire collections with her in mind. Girls across Britain tried to copy her look. Pattie Boyd wasn't just another model, she was becoming a symbol of the swinging 60s. It didn't take long for her life to shift from ordinary shoots to iconic moments. One of those turning points came in 1964 when she was cast in a small role in the Beatles' first feature film, A Hard Day's Night. At first, Pattie hesitated. She had never thought of herself as an actress, and the idea of appearing in a film felt terrifying. But her agent convinced her to take the part, and soon Pattie found herself on set in the middle of a cultural phenomenon. That's where she met George Harrison. At first, their meeting seemed casual, a brief exchange on set, a shy smile, a shared moment during a lunch break. But there was something about George that stood out to Pattie. He wasn't as brash as John, as polished as Paul, or as goofy as Ringo. He had a quiet depth, soft brown eyes, and a gentle way of speaking that immediately caught her attention. For George, Pattie was unlike anyone he'd met before. In a world of screaming fans and constant chaos, she was calm, elegant, and refreshingly real. He asked her out that very day, and though Pattie initially declined, she already had a boyfriend at the time. George didn't forget her. Soon after, her relationship ended, and she and George reconnected. From that moment on, their lives became entwined. Their relationship moved quickly, and by January 1966, the two were married in a small, quiet ceremony. Pattie, just 21 at the time, suddenly found herself thrust into the spotlight in an entirely new way. She wasn't just a model anymore. She was George Harrison's wife, and that role came with both glamour and pressure. At first, Their marriage was filled with love, excitement, and adventure. They traveled, partied, and mingled with some of the biggest names in music, fashion, and art. Pattie was seen as the perfect rock star's wife, beautiful, stylish, and endlessly supportive. George adored her and even began writing music inspired by her, including the timeless classic, Something, which Frank Sinatra once called the greatest love song ever written. For a time, it seemed like a fairy tale. But as the years passed, cracks began to form. George's growing obsession with spirituality, meditation, and later, his own infidelities began to pull them apart. The more he immersed himself in the world of gurus and Eastern philosophy, the more distant he became from Pattie. What started as a shared interest in meditation turned into a wedge between them. George, once so tender, became moody, unpredictable, and unfaithful. The man who had once seemed so different from other rock stars began falling into the same traps of fame and excess. Pattie, meanwhile, struggled to hold on to the marriage. She loved George deeply, but the loneliness and humiliation of being pushed aside began to take its toll. This was when another figure entered the picture, someone who would complicate her life in ways she could never have predicted. Eric Clapton, one of George's closest friends, began to fall hopelessly in love with her. At first, Pattie thought his flirtations were harmless. She assumed it was just part of his rock star bravado. But when Clapton poured his feelings into music, writing the searing, anguished ballad, Layla, as a declaration of his obsession, it became impossible to ignore. Pattie found herself caught between two of the greatest musicians of her generation. George, her husband, the Beatle who had promised her the world, but who was slipping away from her. And Eric, the friend who seemed to see her in ways George no longer did, but who was also deeply troubled, consumed by addiction and self-destruction. This love triangle would become one of the most famous in rock history, and Pattie, the woman at the center of it all, suddenly found her life spiraling into a storm of passion, betrayal, and heartbreak. What began as the fairy tale of a small-town girl turned international muse was about to turn into a tangled web of rivalries, affairs, and broken promises. And the decisions she made would not only change her own life, but ripple out into the lives of the Beatles, Eric Clapton, and the entire music world. The rise of Pattie Boyd was dazzling, but the downfall of her marriage to George Harrison would reveal the darker side of love and fame. The next chapter of her story was no longer about being a muse, but about surviving the chaos of two men who both claimed to love her. And it was only the beginning. Eric Clapton's obsession with Pattie Boyd didn't just emerge overnight. It built slowly, quietly, and then all at once consumed him to the point where he could no longer hide it. By the late 1960s, Clapton was already considered one of the most brilliant guitarists alive, a virtuoso who had earned his reputation in bands like Cream and Derek and the Dominoes. But while fans admired his genius on stage, privately, he was spiraling. His personal life was a mix of insecurities, addictions, and an all-consuming desire for something he couldn't have, the wife of his best friend. George Harrison and Eric Clapton were close, often spending hours together playing guitar, talking music, and sharing ideas. Their friendship was genuine, built on mutual respect, but it was fragile, because in the shadows, Eric was falling in love with Pattie. Unlike George, who had grown distant and unpredictable, Clapton showered her with attention. He noticed her in ways George no longer seemed to, complimenting her, flirting openly, and treating her like she was the center of his world. For Pattie, it was confusing. She was still married, still clinging to the idea of saving her relationship with George, but here was Eric, passionate, attentive, and burning with a kind of intensity she hadn't felt in years. The depth of his feelings became impossible to ignore when Clapton poured his anguish into music. His masterpiece, Layla, wasn't just a song, it was a desperate love letter, a cry from a man who had reached the breaking point. Inspired by a Persian love story about a man driven mad by his obsession for an unattainable woman, Clapton used it as a mirror of his own torment. Every guitar riff, every lyric, was a confession. When Pattie realized she was the inspiration, she was stunned. She hadn't asked for this attention, yet here she was, immortalized in one of the greatest rock songs ever written. The world heard Layla as a classic. For Pattie, it was a storm crashing through her marriage. Things between her and George had already grown tense. His devotion to meditation and spirituality, while inspiring at first, had twisted into something darker. George became moody, distant, and increasingly unfaithful. Affairs began to creep into their relationship, each one cutting deeper into Pattie's ability to trust him. He wasn't the sweet, shy man she'd fallen in love with on the set of A Hard Day's Night. He was unpredictable, at times cold, and living a double life she couldn't ignore. Clapton, meanwhile, was relentless. He declared his love directly to George in a shocking moment of honesty. Imagine the scene. Eric Clapton, one of the greatest musicians of his era, looking his best friend in the eye and confessing, "I'm in love with your wife." It was a betrayal, yes, but also a rare kind of boldness. Few men would ever dare to say such a thing, let alone to a Beatle. George's reaction was equally shocking. Rather than rage, he responded with a cold, almost detached acceptance. At one party, when Clapton pressed the issue, George turned to Pattie and asked her a devastating question. "Who are you going home with tonight?" Pattie, torn, confused, and under immense pressure, chose George. In that moment, she stayed with her husband, but the fracture in their marriage had widened beyond repair. Still, Clapton didn't stop loving her. He couldn't. His obsession dragged him deeper into despair. To numb the pain, he turned heavily to substances, hiding from the world for long stretches, consumed by addiction. His friends watched him spiral, his genius almost lost to the darkness. And yet, through it all, his love for Pattie didn't fade. For her, it was agonizing. She was still bound to George, but George was making it increasingly unbearable. His infidelities became harder to ignore, none more humiliating than his affair with Maureen Starkey, the wife of his bandmate and close friend, Ringo Starr. Pattie described the moment she discovered them together as one of the lowest points of her life. To be betrayed not only by her husband, but in a way that shattered the bonds between friends was too much. George tried to brush it off, even defending Maureen in front of Pattie, as though it was nothing serious. That callousness broke something inside her. Pattie began to see that George wasn't going to fight for her anymore. He had slipped so far into his world of affairs, drugs, and spiritual contradictions that she no longer recognized the man she had once adored. It was only a matter of time before she walked away. When she finally did, she found herself in Clapton's arms. But if she thought leaving George would be the end of her troubles, she was mistaken. Life with Eric was no fairy tale. Clapton, brilliant as he was, carried his own demons. His addiction deepened, and though he had won Pattie at last, his paranoia and destructive habits began to erode their relationship. He accused her of affairs she wasn't having, drank heavily from morning to night, and lashed out in ways that reminded her of the very pain she had tried to escape. She had left one troubled genius for another, and the cycle of heartbreak began again. Yet the irony was impossible to miss. Two of the greatest guitarists of all time, men worshipped by millions, had fought, literally and figuratively, for Pattie Boyd's love. She had been the muse behind legendary songs, the woman both men couldn't let go of, and the silent center of a storm that captured the entire rock world's attention. The love triangle of George, Eric, and Pattie wasn't just gossip. It was a seismic shift that rippled through friendships, marriages, and music itself. By the early 1970s, what had once been the picture-perfect image of George and Pattie had disintegrated completely. Clapton had won her heart, but at a devastating cost. And in the background of all this personal chaos, another woman, Yoko Ono, was rewriting the destiny of the Beatles in her own way. As Pattie's life spiraled into heartbreak and betrayal, Yoko's presence in John Lennon's world was about to create just as much upheaval, though for entirely different reasons. While Pattie had inspired timeless love songs, Yoko would become the face of blame for the unraveling of the greatest band in history. The two stories, unfolding side by side, were about to collide in a way that would forever link their names in Beatles history. Yoko Ono's story is not one of someone who stumbled into fame by accident. Long before she crossed paths with John Lennon, she had been carving out her own unconventional path, one that set her apart from nearly every woman who would ever come near the Beatles' orbit. Born in Tokyo in 1933 to a wealthy banking family, Yoko grew up with both privilege and hardship. She experienced the terror of World War II firsthand, living through bombings and food shortages, moments that shaped her fierce independence and her distrust of conformity. When she moved to New York in 1952, she immersed herself in the city's underground art scene, a world of avant-garde performances and radical new ideas. She was nothing like the demure, fashion-perfect women who filled magazines in London. Instead, Yoko stood on stage screaming into microphones, inviting audiences to cut away pieces of her clothing and presenting empty canvases as art. To many, it looked bizarre, even ridiculous. But to those who understood her, Yoko was a visionary. She wasn't trying to entertain, she was trying to provoke thought, to challenge what people believed art and music should be. This was the Yoko who walked into John Lennon's life in 1966 at the Indica Gallery in London, where she was hosting an exhibition. Lennon was 26, already world famous, but privately restless and searching. When he met Yoko, she offered something he hadn't found in the fame, the fans, or even in the music he made with Paul. She gave him a new lens through which to see the world. The connection was immediate, but it didn't turn romantic until 1968, at a time when Lennon was unraveling. The Beatles were struggling with the loss of their manager Brian Epstein, who had died the year before. Epstein had been the glue that kept the band together, and without him, leadership conflicts and personal tensions began boiling over. Lennon, who had been experimenting heavily with LSD and grappling with a growing sense of emptiness, found himself disillusioned by everything, even the spiritual path of transcendental meditation that had once offered him hope. Into that void stepped Yoko Ono. She wasn't like anyone else in Lennon's world. She was bold, cerebral, and unafraid to challenge him. She didn't treat him like a Beatle, she treated him like a man, flawed and searching. For Lennon, that was magnetic. He quickly drew her into every corner of his life, and unlike the other Beatles, wives and girlfriends, Yoko didn't stay on the sidelines. She became his collaborator, his confidant, and most controversially, his constant presence in the studio. This was a seismic break from tradition. Until then, the Beatles' recording sessions were sacred, a space reserved for the 4 band members. The wives and girlfriends knew their place, close enough to support, far enough to never interfere. Yoko ignored those rules entirely. She sat beside John during recording sessions, offering her thoughts, sometimes even recording her own experimental pieces alongside him. To Paul, George, and Ringo, it felt like an intrusion. To fans, it was scandalous. To John, it was necessary. Yoko wasn't just a partner. She was his shield, his anchor, and his new source of artistic energy. Her influence could be seen everywhere. Their first musical collaboration, the experimental album Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins, shocked the world not only because of its avant-garde sound, but also because of its infamous cover photo, John and Yoko naked, standing together without apology. The message was clear. John was no longer just a Beatle. He was now half of a new duo, and Yoko was at the center of it. This shift caused waves inside the band. McCartney, who had long been Lennon's closest creative partner, suddenly found himself competing with Yoko for John's attention. The tension was palpable. During the White Album sessions, Yoko recorded hours of commentary on a tape recorder, offering her stream-of-consciousness thoughts about the music and the band. In one moment, she remarked that if Paul were a woman, she would be jealous of him. It was a startling confession, revealing that Yoko didn't just see herself as John's lover, she saw Paul as a rival. The band, already fractured, began to splinter even further. Fans, meanwhile, turned on Yoko with fury. To them, she was the outsider who had invaded their beloved Beatles, the strange woman who dared to sit in the studio where no one else had ever been allowed. She was foreign, she was different, and she became the perfect scapegoat for a band that was already collapsing under the weight of fame, egos, and disagreements. Was it fair? Probably not. The Beatles' breakup had many causes: business disputes over management, creative clashes, personal differences, but Yoko's presence became the easiest explanation. She broke up the Beatles, became the narrative, repeated endlessly, cementing her place in history as the villain of the story. But the truth was more complicated. Lennon had already been drifting away, already searching for something beyond the Beatles. Yoko didn't create that fracture, she simply filled it. For John, she was a new beginning, even if it meant the end of the band. To outsiders, this dynamic looked like destruction. To John, it was salvation. By 1969, as the Beatles stumbled toward their inevitable breakup, Yoko's role in Lennon's life only grew stronger. They married, staged bed-ins for peace, and began crafting their identity as a couple who would use art and music as political statements. The Beatles had been about changing music. John and Yoko were about changing the world, or at least trying to. And while fans raged and critics sneered, Lennon stood firm. He once said, "If they only knew how much she means to me, they wouldn't criticize her." In the end, Yoko Ono became more than just a wife. She was Lennon's partner in every sense: creative, emotional, spiritual. She challenged him, shielded him, and in many ways redefined him. But her presence also created a divide that could never be repaired. For Pattie Boyd, who had lived in the spotlight as the beloved muse, Yoko was something entirely different. A woman who refused to fit into the mold, who embraced being the outsider, and who, fairly or not, was branded as the woman who broke the Beatles. And it was this stark difference between them, the adored muse and the reviled disruptor, that made their stories collide in such a dramatic way. As Pattie's marriage collapsed under the weight of betrayal, Yoko was pulling John further from the Beatles' world, creating a rupture that would never heal. The two women didn't just live alongside the Beatles, they became symbols of what the band was losing. And while Pattie inspired love songs, Yoko inspired blame. Together, they shaped the legend of the Beatles, rise and fall more than anyone could have imagined. By the late 1960s, the cracks inside the Beatles were no longer invisible. They were gaping wounds that everyone around them could see. What had once been the most unified, unstoppable band in the world was turning into a battlefield of competing visions, bruised egos, and constant arguments. At the center of this chaos stood John Lennon and Paul McCartney, two men whose creative partnership had built the foundation of the band, but whose relationship was now being pulled apart by conflicting ambitions, business disputes, and the presence of Yoko Ono. For years, Lennon and McCartney had been inseparable, feeding off each other's ideas, finishing each other's lyrics, and driving one another to new heights. But with Brian Epstein gone, the manager who had once balanced their differences, the band was rudderless. Paul tried to step into the leadership role, pushing for rehearsals, projects, and structure, but his attempts often came across as bossy, especially to George and Ringo, who resented his controlling nature. John, meanwhile, was drifting further from the Beatles' orbit, relying more on Yoko for inspiration and support. He no longer needed Paul in the same way, and that shift was devastating to their once unbreakable bond. The recording sessions for the White Album revealed just how fractured things had become. The sessions dragged on endlessly, with each Beatle working on their own songs rather than collaborating as they had in the past. Yoko's constant presence in the studio was unlike anything the others had experienced, and while Lennon insisted she stay by his side, Paul, George, and Ringo grew increasingly frustrated. They weren't used to outsiders commenting on their music, and Yoko's avant-garde ideas clashed with the band's traditional ways of working. Tensions simmered until they eventually boiled over, with arguments breaking out daily and walkouts becoming routine. The rivalry between Paul and Yoko was particularly sharp. Paul had always been Lennon's closest collaborator, but now Yoko seemed to occupy that role. She was the one Lennon leaned on for feedback, the one he looked to for validation. For Yoko, Paul wasn't just a bandmate, he was competition for John's loyalty. In private, she even admitted that if Paul had been a woman, she would have been jealous of him. That level of rivalry created an invisible wall in the studio, one that grew taller with each passing day. But creative differences weren't the only thing tearing the Beatles apart. Money and management became just as destructive as the music disputes. After Epstein's death, the question of who would guide the Beatles financially became urgent. Paul wanted to bring in the Eastmans, his future wife Linda's father and brother, who were experienced lawyers. John, George, and Ringo, however, sided with Alan Klein, a shrewd manager who promised to maximize their earnings. The split over Klein versus the Eastmans wasn't just a disagreement, it was a declaration of war. On one side was Paul, determined to protect the band's legacy and wary of Klein's reputation. On the other side were Lennon, Harrison, and Starr, united with Yoko's influence behind them, convinced Klein was the right choice. The decision deepened the rift, turning business meetings into shouting matches and fueling a level of resentment that spilled over into the music. By 1969, the tension was impossible to ignore. The Get Back sessions, meant to capture the band returning to their roots, instead revealed how far they had fallen. Cameras rolled as arguments erupted, as George threatened to quit, as Ringo sat silently through endless bickering, and as Paul tried desperately to hold it all together while John appeared increasingly uninterested. It was in this environment that Lennon began to openly prioritize Yoko over the band. He no longer saw the Beatles as the center of his world. Yoko was. Their relationship wasn't just personal, it was political, artistic, and revolutionary. Together, they staged bed-ins for peace, recorded experimental albums, and presented themselves as a new kind of cultural force. To John, the Beatles now felt like a cage. To Paul, it was betrayal. Fans, of course, laid the blame squarely at Yoko's feet. To them, she was the intruder who had stolen John away, the reason the Lennon-McCartney partnership had collapsed. But in truth, the cracks had existed long before Yoko ever appeared. The endless touring had drained them, Epstein's death had left them leaderless, and years of constant pressure had eroded their unity. Yoko didn't create the fractures, she simply amplified them. Still, the symbolism was powerful. While Paul showed up to the studio trying to keep the Beatles alive, John arrived with Yoko, signaling to everyone that the old days were over. The dynamic had shifted permanently. By 1970, the band was barely functioning, and the final blow came when Paul announced in a press release that he was leaving the Beatles. Fans were devastated, but insiders knew it had been inevitable. John had already privately told the others he was done. The dream was over. And in the eyes of the world, Yoko Ono became the face of that ending. Lennon's devotion to her, his willingness to put her above the band, made it easy for people to point to her as the villain. Meanwhile, Paul carried the image of the loyal soldier, the one trying to keep the band alive. It was a narrative that stuck for decades, even as both Lennon and McCartney later admitted that the breakup was far more complicated than Yoko's presence alone. The rivalry between John and Paul had reached its breaking point, and Yoko was both a cause and a symbol of that shift. The Beatles weren't just a band anymore. They were a fractured family, pulled apart by love, business, ego, and change. And as they unraveled, the two women closest to them, Pattie Boyd and Yoko Ono, stood as reminders of how personal lives and public legends are forever intertwined. For Pattie, it had been love triangles and betrayal that reshaped her world. For Yoko, it was devotion and defiance that made her the target of blame. And soon, the stories of these two women would be set against each other more directly, as fans and history compared the adored muse to the despised outsider, asking who truly had the greater impact on the Beatles' legacy. When history remembers the Beatles, it is impossible to separate the music from the women who became entangled in their world. Pattie Boyd and Yoko Ono, two women from entirely different backgrounds, became symbols of everything fans loved and hated about the band's final years. Pattie, the golden-haired English muse, embodied the charm and beauty of the Swinging Sixties. She was adored by fans, cherished by musicians, and immortalized in some of the greatest love songs ever written. George Harrison wrote something for her, a song Frank Sinatra once called the greatest love song of the century. Eric Clapton poured his torment over her into Layla, a track so raw and desperate it became one of rock's defining anthems. Pattie was the inspiration, the muse who seemed to exist effortlessly in the background, loved by the Beatles, circle and accepted by the public as though she belonged there. Yoko Ono was the opposite. She was never just in the background, never content to be a silent figure orbiting the band. She stepped into the center, unafraid to challenge traditions and unapologetic about her role in John Lennon's life. Where Pattie blended in seamlessly, Yoko stood out defiantly. She wasn't British, she wasn't familiar, and she didn't fit the mold of what fans expected. Her Japanese heritage and avant-garde art background made her an outsider in a world that worshipped familiarity. And because she was different, she was easy to blame. Fans never forgave her for being in the studio, for speaking up during recording sessions, for daring to sit beside John when the Beatles were at work. She became the face of the band's unraveling, accused endlessly of breaking up the Beatles, while the deeper truths, ego battles, business wars, and exhaustion were ignored. The contrast between Pattie and Yoko was striking. Pattie inspired songs that spoke to devotion and longing, music the world celebrated and sang along to. Yoko inspired songs that confused, divided, and challenged listeners, projects with John that pushed boundaries but alienated Beatles fans. Pattie was loved for being silent and beautiful, Yoko was hated for being outspoken and unafraid. Yet both women, in their own ways, shaped the legacy of the Beatles. Beneath the public perception, there was tension between them, though not always the kind fans imagined. Yoko once hinted at jealousy, not toward Pattie specifically, but toward what she represented. Pattie was embraced, adored, and seen as an effortless part of the Beatles' glamorous world. Yoko, meanwhile, was vilified, painted as an intruder who had destroyed something perfect. The comparison was unavoidable, and for Yoko, it must have cut deeply. Paul McCartney later recalled how Yoko once admitted that if Paul had been a woman, she would have been jealous of him, because he competed with her for John's attention. If Paul could be seen as a rival, how much more must Pattie, the beloved muse, have symbolized a world Yoko would never be accepted into? Decades later, both women would speak about their roles with very different tones. Pattie reflected with grace, acknowledging the love, the heartbreak, and the chaos, but always with a certain wistful acceptance. She admitted George was the love of her life, even after their marriage fell apart, and she remained close friends with Clapton despite his flaws. Her reflections carried a kind of warmth, the voice of someone who had lived through extraordinary times and survived them with dignity. Yoko, in contrast, remained defiant. She rejected the label of scapegoat and insisted she had not broken up the Beatles. She reminded people that John had already decided to leave before their relationship fully began, and she pointed to the business conflicts and creative rifts as the real causes of the split. She defended herself against decades of blame, unafraid to say she had been misunderstood. Even Paul eventually admitted it wasn't her fault, conceding that John had been drawn to her because she gave him something the Beatles could no longer provide. In the end, Pattie and Yoko represent two sides of the Beatles' legacy. Pattie was the muse who inspired beauty, romance, and longing, the woman behind the love songs the world treasures. Yoko was the disruptor, the woman who challenged Lennon to reinvent himself, who became the lightning rod for anger, and who carried the weight of blame for the band's collapse. One was loved for fitting in, the other hated for refusing to. Yet both left indelible marks on history. Without Pattie, the Beatles and Clapton would never have written some of their greatest songs. Without Yoko, Lennon would never have found the creative rebirth that defined his later years. Together, they remind us that behind the music were real people, flawed and complicated, living messy lives under the harshest spotlight imaginable. The Beatles' breakup wasn't the fault of one woman or one decision. It was the inevitable result of years of tension, ambition, and exhaustion. But the stories of Pattie Boyd and Yoko Ono gave the world faces to attach to that collapse. One adored, one reviled, both unforgettable. And in the end, their impact on the Beatles' story was undeniable. They didn't just love the men behind the music. They helped shape the music itself, leaving a legacy that still sparks debate, passion, and fascination half a century later. In the end, the Beatles' story wasn't just about four men changing music forever. It was also about the women who stepped into their orbit and left marks that history could never erase. Pattie Boyd, the quiet muse, became the face of beauty, longing, and inspiration. Her presence lit a spark in George Harrison and Eric Clapton that gave the world timeless classics like Something and Layla. She represented the softer side of rock history, the woman adored for her elegance, whose love story became legend even as it ended in heartbreak. Yoko Ono, on the other hand, was never content to stay in the background. She challenged John Lennon, pushed him out of his comfort zone, and became his fiercest ally. To many fans, she was the villain, the outsider blamed for breaking up the Beatles. But in truth, she was simply the embodiment of change, a symbol of John's desire to leave behind the past and forge a new identity. Without Pattie, some of the greatest love songs ever written might not exist. Without Yoko, John Lennon's reinvention as an artist and activist might never have happened. One woman inspired romance, the other inspired reinvention. One was adored, the other vilified. Yet both defined the final chapter of the Beatles in ways no one else could. Their stories remind us that history is never black and white. It's not about one person breaking up a band or another holding it together. It's about the tangled mix of love, art, jealousy, and ambition that made the Beatles human. Decades later, fans still debate. Was Yoko truly to blame, or was she just an easy target? Was Pattie the symbol of purity, or was she caught in her own web of betrayals? The truth lies somewhere in between. What's undeniable is that without Pattie Boyd and Yoko Ono, the Beatles' story wouldn't be the same. They didn't just stand beside legends, they became legends in their own right. So the question remains, were these women the downfall of the Beatles or the hidden force that shaped their greatest songs?